Imagine waking up in a world where the very air you breathe is heavy with danger, where every day is a battle just to stay alive. No modern hospitals, no supermarkets, no instant communication. The medieval era wasn't some romanticized fairy tale with knights in shining armor and grand castles. It was a brutal, unforgiving reality, filled with hardship, disease, and death lurking in every shadow. If you think you could survive in medieval times, think again. This is what medieval survival really took, and why, despite your modern conveniences, you probably wouldn't make it. Surviving in the Middle Ages was not about fancy swords or heroic battles. It was about sheer grit, knowledge, and a constant struggle against an environment that could kill you in 1,000 ways. Whether you were a peasant working the fields, a tradesman in a crowded town, or even a noble trying to protect your land, survival demanded toughness, skills, and a brutal acceptance of risk. One of the biggest misconceptions about medieval survival is the belief that it was primarily warfare that defined life. Yes, wars, invasions, and feudal battles were terrifying realities, but they were only part of a larger picture. Most people spent their lives fighting against hunger, disease, poor sanitation, and brutal working conditions. The average life expectancy hovered around 30 to 40 years, and infant mortality rates were staggering. Death was a constant companion, often striking without warning. Diseases like the Black Death wiped out entire villages, sometimes killing up to 60% of the population. There were no antibiotics, no vaccinations, and little understanding of germs. Illnesses spread rapidly through crowded towns and filthy living conditions. Even minor infections could turn fatal because medical knowledge was primitive, and treatments often did more harm than good. Food scarcity was another relentless challenge. Farming depended entirely on weather and seasons, with droughts, floods, or early frosts wiping out crops and causing famine. Peasants had little control over their diets, mostly bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables they could grow, rarely meat or dairy. Malnutrition weakened bodies, making people more vulnerable to disease. Starvation and its slow suffering were common. But survival wasn't only about battling external forces. Social structures were harsh and unforgiving. Feudal lords held power over peasants, who owed heavy taxes and labor services. A simple failure to meet obligations could lead to eviction or punishment. Justice was brutal and swift. Public executions, torture, and imprisonment were part of everyday life. There was little room for mercy or second chances. In towns, life was cramped and unsanitary. Houses were packed tightly together, often made of wood and straw, making fires a constant threat. Wells and cesspits were dangerously close, contaminating drinking water and spreading disease. The stench and filth were overwhelming. Personal hygiene was minimal, and baths were infrequent, often linked with superstition rather than cleanliness. Despite these challenges, medieval people developed survival strategies that helped them endure. They relied heavily on community bonds, faith, and knowledge passed down through generations. Skills like farming, hunting, herbal medicine, and basic craftsmanship were essential. The church provided some social support and education, though often entwined with fear and control. The mental toughness required was immense. To survive, people had to accept that death was never far away. Life was fragile, unpredictable, and often cruel. Courage wasn't just about facing enemies on the battlefield. It was about facing hunger, sickness, and hardship day after day, year after year. In this series, we'll explore the harsh realities of medieval survival, what it really took to live, and why modern humans, with all our technology and comforts, would struggle immensely in that world. We'll look beyond the romantic myths and uncover the brutal truth of what daily life demanded. From deadly diseases and famine to social oppression and the constant threat of violence, medieval survival was a relentless test of endurance and willpower. So strap in and prepare yourself. The medieval world was no place for the faint of heart. This is what medieval survival really took, and why you probably wouldn't make it. One of the most crucial aspects of medieval survival was the ability to secure reliable food sources. The majority of medieval people were peasants, who depended almost entirely on agriculture to sustain themselves and their families. Unlike today's industrial farming with machinery and fertilizers, medieval farming was manual, labor-intensive, and vulnerable to the whims of nature. Farming tools were simple: wooden plows pulled by oxen or horses, sickles and scythes for harvesting grain, and hand tools for planting and weeding. Soil quality varied widely, and overworked land often lost fertility. Crop rotation was practiced in some regions, but many farmers struggled with poor yields year after year. The staple diet consisted mostly of bread made from rye or barley, coarse, and often infested with weevils. Meat was a luxury for most peasants, reserved for special occasions or the wealthy elite. Vegetables like onions, cabbage, beans, and peas supplemented their meals, but variety was limited. Protein came primarily from fish, which many villagers consumed, especially on days dictated by religious fasting. Preserving food was another major challenge. Without refrigeration, people relied on drying, smoking, salting, and fermenting to keep food from spoiling. This meant diets were often repetitive and nutritionally insufficient, contributing to malnutrition and vulnerability to disease. Hunting was another means of survival, but it was often restricted by law. Forests were owned by nobles who held exclusive hunting rights, and peasants, caught poachers, faced harsh punishments. Despite this, some villagers risked it to supplement their diet with game, like rabbits, deer, and wild birds. Fishing was somewhat more accessible, especially for those living near rivers, lakes, or the sea. Fish provided essential nutrition, especially during Lent and other religious fasting periods when meat consumption was forbidden. Fishing techniques included nets, traps, and hand lines, but yields were unpredictable. Seasonal changes governed daily life. Winters were harsh and deadly. Food stores often ran low, and cold made survival difficult. Many people suffered from illnesses aggravated by poor nutrition and exposure. Spring brought hope and renewal, but also hard labor, preparing fields and planting seeds. Summer was a time of intense work to tend crops and harvest. Autumn was critical for gathering and storing food for the lean months ahead. The unpredictability of medieval weather compounded these difficulties. Extended droughts could devastate harvests, as could excessive rain, leading to flooding and rot. Crop failures led to famine, social unrest, and sometimes mass migration as people sought better conditions elsewhere. Shelter was another vital survival component. Peasant cottages were small, often just a single room, shared by the entire family and sometimes livestock. Walls were made from woven sticks, covered with mud, wattle and daub, and roofs from thatch. These structures offered minimal protection from weather or cold. Chimneys were rare, so smoke from indoor fires escaped through holes or gaps, filling the living space with smoke and soot. Wealthier individuals lived in stone houses or castles with multiple rooms and better insulation. However, even the nobility faced dangers like sieges, fires, and disease outbreaks. Castles were fortress-like, but not immune to hardship. Hygiene was rudimentary. Baths were infrequent and often communal, linked to religious or social events, rather than daily cleanliness. The lack of sanitation meant that lice, fleas, and other parasites were common, spreading disease and discomfort. People often wore the same clothes for long periods, further contributing to poor hygiene and health problems. Clothing was typically made from wool or linen, handmade and often rough. Colors were muted, except for the wealthy who could afford dyed fabrics. Clothing was functional, designed to provide some warmth and protection, but not comfort as we understand it today. Survival also depended heavily on social networks and community support. Villages often functioned as tight-knit units, where cooperation was essential. Shared labor during planting and harvest seasons, mutual defense, and communal celebrations forged strong bonds. Neighbors helped each other repair homes, tend animals, and care for the sick. Religious faith was a cornerstone of medieval life and survival. The church provided spiritual guidance, social services, and education for some. Monasteries were centers of learning and medicine. However, religious belief could also be a double-edged sword, fostering fear, superstition, and persecution, especially toward minorities, witches, or heretics. Education was limited, mostly confined to clergy and nobility. Literacy rates were low among peasants, making oral tradition and communal memory vital for passing down knowledge about farming, medicine, and survival skills. Mental resilience was perhaps the most underrated survival tool. Enduring the constant presence of death, hardship, and uncertainty required a level of toughness that is hard for modern people to imagine. Medieval literature and art often reflect a worldview shaped by mortality, emphasizing the transient nature of life and the hope for salvation beyond death. In summary, medieval survival was a complex and brutal endeavor. It demanded physical endurance, practical skills, community cooperation, and psychological strength. The combination of disease, famine, harsh living conditions, and rigid social systems created a world where life was fragile and fleeting. As you reflect on this, it becomes clear why you likely wouldn't make it in medieval times despite your modern advantages. The skills, mindset, and sheer endurance needed to survive day to day were developed over lifetimes in an environment shaped by relentless challenges. In the next part, we will delve deeper into the specific dangers posed by medieval warfare and violence, and how those threats compounded the difficulties of everyday survival for people from all walks of life. Medieval violence wasn't confined to organized warfare alone. The lawlessness that permeated much of the countryside meant that even routine life was steeped in danger. Bandit gangs operated in forests and along roads, taking advantage of weak or corrupt local authorities. These groups could range from desperate peasants driven by hunger to ruthless criminals who terrorized entire regions. Travelers had to be constantly vigilant, often traveling in groups or under guard to avoid becoming victims. Within villages, disputes over property, grazing rights, or family honor sometimes exploded into physical confrontations. Unlike today's societies, where laws and courts attempt to regulate conflicts, medieval justice was often personal and immediate. Blood feuds could last for decades, with cycles of revenge killings that engulfed entire families and communities. This persistent threat created a culture of suspicion and fear, where loyalty and alliances were crucial for survival. Peasant uprisings, while not common, revealed the simmering tensions beneath the surface. Events like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 or the German Peasants' War of the 16th century were violent expressions of desperation against oppressive taxation and feudal bondage. These rebellions were brutally suppressed, reinforcing the precariousness of peasant life. For the nobility, survival was a matter of maintaining power and defending lands from rivals. Castle sieges were frequent, involving brutal tactics like starvation, treachery, and siege engines designed to breach walls. Soldiers were often mercenaries or conscripts, poorly paid and motivated, fighting in grim, dirty conditions. Injury and death were common, and without modern medical care, battlefield wounds frequently led to infection and death. The psychological impact of living in a violent age was profound. Children learned early to fear outsiders and to respect authority figures who controlled force. Tales of heroic knights and noble deeds coexisted with grim stories of massacres and betrayals. Life expectancy was short, and many never lived past childhood or early adulthood. Wildlife also posed real threats. Wolves traveled in packs, sometimes raiding villages for livestock or even humans. Bears, boars, and venomous snakes added to the dangers of rural life. Without firearms, medieval people relied on bows, spears, and traps. But hunting large predators was perilous. Disease often followed violence. Armies and bandits spread infection as they moved, and unsanitary conditions in camps or besieged towns were breeding grounds for epidemics. Plague and other illnesses could decimate populations after a single conflict, compounding the trauma of war. Fire hazards were another relentless threat. Most homes were built from wood and thatch, materials highly flammable. Cooking and heating relied on open fires, increasing the risk of accidental blazes. Towns with tightly packed buildings were especially vulnerable. Firefighting techniques were basic and ineffective, and large fires could destroy entire communities. Despite all these dangers, medieval people developed adaptive strategies. Fortifications and watchtowers dotted the landscape, serving as refuges during raids. Villagers often organized militias or night watches to protect against bandits. Community cooperation was vital, with mutual aid helping rebuild after disasters. Survival also depended on keen social awareness. Knowing who to trust, when to seek protection from powerful lords, or how to navigate shifting alliances could mean the difference between life and death. The social fabric was fragile, but crucial. Religion played a dual role, offering comfort and hope in a dangerous world, but also sometimes justifying violence or exclusion. Crusades, inquisitions, and religious persecutions were violent expressions of faith that added to the suffering. In sum, medieval survival meant living constantly with the threat of violence, external and internal, human and natural. It required physical courage, social intelligence, and a willingness to accept harsh realities. Few could truly thrive, and many simply hoped to survive one more day. Survival in the medieval period was not only a matter of facing external threats, such as violence, disease, or natural disasters. It was also deeply tied to the structure of medieval family life, gender roles, and community bonds. To truly understand why surviving medieval life was so difficult, one must grasp how people lived together, supported each other, and were shaped by their social environments. Family was the basic unit of survival in medieval society. However, unlike today's typical nuclear family, medieval families often extended beyond parents and children to include grandparents, uncles, aunts, and even unrelated members like servants or apprentices living under one roof or within a close-knit household. These extended family units were vital for pooling resources, labor, and protection. Children's survival depended heavily on their family's status and resources. Infant mortality was devastatingly high, with estimates suggesting that between 30% to 50% of children died before reaching adulthood. Many families had numerous children to offset this high death rate, but raising children was expensive and time-consuming. Breastfeeding was common, but wet nurses were often employed by wealthier families. Malnutrition and disease claimed countless young lives. Gender roles were sharply defined and influenced survival strategies. Men were primarily responsible for physical labor, working fields, hunting, defending homes, or performing skilled crafts. Women's roles were centered around childbearing, household management, food preparation, and often tending to animals or gardens. However, these roles were flexible in times of crisis. Women sometimes fought or took over traditionally male duties when necessary. Marriage was both a social and economic arrangement, often arranged by families to secure alliances, property, or status. Love and romance were less prioritized than survival and social advancement. Women's legal rights were limited, and they were typically under the authority of their fathers, husbands, or male relatives. Widows had more autonomy but faced significant challenges maintaining livelihoods. Household labor was grueling. Women rose before dawn to prepare food, often from limited ingredients. They churned butter, baked bread, spun wool, and made clothes, all essential for family survival. Men worked long days plowing fields, repairing fences, and managing livestock. Children contributed early, helping with chores and learning skills necessary for adulthood. Community ties extended beyond families. Villages were interdependent networks where survival often required cooperation. Fields were worked collectively in some places, with crop rotation and shared tools. Harvest festivals and religious holidays punctuated the year, providing moments of relief, celebration, and strengthening social bonds. Feasts and communal events were not only cultural, but survival tools. Sharing food and labor reinforced alliances and redistributed scarce resources. At the same time, social hierarchies were strictly maintained during such events. Lords and clergy held prominent positions, reminding peasants of their place. Religion was a central pillar of medieval life, deeply intertwined with family and community survival. The church dictated moral behavior, provided education and charity, and offered hope of salvation in an uncertain world. Parish churches were social centers, and festivals honored saints believed to protect crops, health, and livelihoods. Life was a constant balance between hardship and community. When crises hit such as famine, disease, or invasion, families depended on neighbors for aid. Mutual support networks could mean the difference between survival and starvation. Yet, mistrust and competition were never far beneath the surface, especially during lean times. Education was limited for most, but practical knowledge was passed orally and through apprenticeship. Skills in farming, animal husbandry, herbal medicine, and craft were essential for survival and often learned within the family or village. Death was an ever-present reality shaping family dynamics. Mourning practices, burial rites, and beliefs about the afterlife helped people cope, but also reinforced social order. The fear of dying young pushed many to live cautiously, but it also bred fatalism. In towns and cities, family life was complicated by growing populations, trade, and new social classes. Urban families faced different survival challenges, crowded conditions, disease, and economic instability, but also opportunities through guilds and markets. Overall, medieval family and community life was a complex web of mutual dependence and social control, tightly linked to survival strategies. Understanding these relationships reveals why surviving in medieval times required not only physical strength, but also social intelligence, adaptability, and resilience. The harsh realities of medieval survival extended far beyond the family and community. One of the most significant aspects shaping survival chances was the nature of medieval agriculture and food production. The vast majority of the population depended directly on the land for sustenance, making farming both a livelihood and a precarious gamble against nature's whims. Medieval farming was labor-intensive and primitive by modern standards. Without mechanized tools, plowing, sowing, and harvesting required countless hours of hard manual labor. Farmers used wooden plows reinforced with iron, pulled by oxen or horses. But even these implements were rudimentary. Fields were often small, fragmented, and scattered across a lord's estate, complicating efficient cultivation. Crop rotation was an important practice, but not universally applied or well understood. Many farmers followed a three-field system, one field planted in the autumn with winter crops like wheat or rye, another with spring crops like oats or barley, and the third left fallow to recover. This method helped prevent soil exhaustion, but still limited productivity. Weather was an unpredictable and deadly factor. Droughts could parch fields, while excessive rain caused flooding and rotted crops. Harsh winters shortened growing seasons. A single failed harvest could plunge a family or village into famine, a recurrent and deadly threat. Livestock were vital, but also vulnerable. Oxen and horses provided the muscle for plowing and transportation. Sheep and goats offered wool, milk, and meat, while pigs scavenged in forests and helped recycle waste. Disease, theft, or poor pasture could decimate herds, worsening food insecurity. Preserving food for winter was a constant challenge. Without refrigeration, people relied on drying, salting, smoking, and fermenting to keep meat and fish edible for months. Root vegetables and grains were stored in pits or granaries. But losses to pests and rot were common. Hunting supplemented diets, but was restricted by law. Forests were often royal or noble preserves, and peasants caught poachers faced severe punishments. Yet wild game deer, boar, rabbits was highly prized and provided vital protein when available. Fishing was another food source for those near rivers, lakes, or the sea. Fish was especially important during religious fasting days when meat was forbidden. Nets, traps, and hooks were basic but effective tools, and fishing communities developed specialized knowledge passed down through generations. Famine was a constant specter. Periodic crop failures, compounded by war, disease, or poor harvests, led to widespread starvation. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 devastated much of Europe, killing millions. People resorted to desperate measures, eating tree bark, roots, or even cannibalism in extreme cases. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, increasing susceptibility to disease and lowering chances of survival. Children and the elderly were most at risk during famines, often suffering irreversible harm. The relationship between peasants and their lords was shaped by these survival needs. Peasants owed rents, taxes, and labor in exchange for land use. Lords controlled mills, ovens, and common resources, taking a significant share of produce. Failure to meet obligations could result in eviction or punishment, adding pressure to already fragile survival. Markets and trade offered some relief by allowing access to goods not locally produced. However, transport was slow and risky, and prices fluctuated wildly with supply and demand. Merchants were vulnerable to bandits and political instability. Food security was not only a matter of survival, but deeply intertwined with medieval politics and social stability. Famine and hunger could spark unrest, revolts, or migrations. Lords and kings had vested interests in maintaining productive lands and feeding their populations, but often struggled to do so effectively. In cities, food supply was even more precarious. Urban populations depended on rural farmers and complex supply chains. Food shortages could quickly turn deadly, exacerbated by poor sanitation and disease. Ultimately, medieval agriculture and food production were a constant balancing act between natural limits and human needs. The struggle to grow enough food under difficult conditions shaped every aspect of medieval life, from social structures to daily routines. Understanding this reality explains why survival required not only physical endurance, but also strategic planning, cooperation, and sometimes sheer luck. Survival in medieval towns and cities introduced an entirely new set of challenges beyond what rural villagers faced. As populations grew, urban centers became hubs of commerce, culture, and power, but also hotspots for disease, overcrowding, and poverty. The promise of work and relative security drew peasants to cities, yet for many, city life proved as harsh as the countryside, if not worse. One of the biggest threats in medieval towns was sanitation, or more accurately, the lack thereof. Sewage disposal systems were primitive or non-existent. Waste, including human excrement, household garbage, and animal refuse, was often dumped into streets or nearby rivers. This filth created breeding grounds for rats, flies, and disease-carrying insects, rapidly spreading illnesses like typhus and dysentery. Water supply posed another problem. Wells and cisterns provided drinking water, but contamination was common. People sometimes drank from the same streams or rivers that carried their waste. Cholera and other waterborne diseases could devastate populations in a matter of days. Fires were a constant danger in crowded medieval cities, built mostly from timber and thatch. Open hearths, used for cooking and heating, could easily spark massive conflagrations. With narrow streets and tightly packed houses, fires spread rapidly, destroying entire neighborhoods. Firefighting was rudimentary, relying on buckets, leather pumps, and fire hooks, often too little too late. The architecture of medieval towns reflected a tension between defense and livability. City walls and gates provided protection against external threats, but constrained growth. Inside, narrow alleys, multi-story timber-framed houses, and market squares formed a labyrinthine environment that was difficult to police or control. Guilds and trade organizations structured economic life, setting standards for crafts, controlling apprenticeships, and regulating prices. While these institutions offered some security and social support, economic competition and inequality remained intense. Many urban dwellers lived in poverty, relying on begging, charity, or dangerous labor to survive. Disease outbreaks were frequent and terrifying. The bubonic plague struck cities repeatedly, wiping out large portions of the population. Public health measures were minimal, and knowledge of disease transmission was almost non-existent. Quarantine zones, when enforced, were often arbitrary and ineffective. Social order in medieval towns was fragile. Crowds could quickly become mobs during times of food shortage, taxation disputes, or political unrest. Riots and revolts were common, underscoring the precariousness of survival for many urban residents. Children growing up in cities faced hazards ranging from malnutrition to accidents in busy markets and streets. Apprenticeships provided training, but could also be exploitative, with long hours and harsh discipline. Despite these hardships, towns were centers of opportunity. Markets allowed access to goods and foodstuffs from distant regions. Churches, guild halls, and festivals fostered community and identity. The urban environment demanded adaptability, negotiation skills, and resilience qualities necessary for survival. The juxtaposition of wealth and poverty, hope and despair, opportunity and danger, defined medieval urban life. For many, survival meant navigating this complex world daily, balancing risks and rewards in a cityscape shaped by human ambition and natural limits. In summary, surviving medieval life in towns demanded an understanding of complex social and environmental factors. The physical dangers of disease, fire, and pollution were compounded by economic and political instability. This reality explains why many who moved to cities seeking better lives found themselves trapped in cycles of hardship and vulnerability. Survival in the medieval world demanded far more than strength and endurance. It required a mastery of conflict, protection, and navigating a world steeped in violence and warfare. From local feuds to large-scale wars, the constant threat of violence shaped daily life and tested the resilience of every individual. Medieval warfare was brutal, relentless, and deeply ingrained in the social fabric. Lords and kings relied on their armies not only to defend territory, but to assert power and maintain order. For peasants, soldiers, and townsfolk alike, violence could erupt without warning through raids, skirmishes, or full-scale battles. The nature of medieval combat was far from the romanticized vision of chivalrous knights in shining armor. Most soldiers were peasants, conscripted into service, poorly equipped and trained, facing brutal conditions. Armies often consisted of a mix of cavalry, infantry, and archers, with tactics shaped by terrain and available resources. Armor and weaponry were expensive and varied widely depending on wealth and status. Knights wore chainmail or plate armor, wielding swords, lances, and maces. But such protection was unavailable to most foot soldiers who might only carry spears, clubs, or simple bows. Sieges were common during medieval warfare, as fortified castles and walled cities were central to territorial control. Siege warfare involved starvation, bombardment with catapults or trebuchets, and undermining walls. Civilians inside besieged areas suffered immensely, facing starvation, disease, and slaughter if defenders failed. Survival during conflict extended beyond the battlefield. Civilians often bore the brunt of war through looting, forced conscription, displacement, and destruction of crops and homes. Refugees fled to walled towns or monasteries for protection, but resources there could quickly become scarce. Medieval justice and law enforcement were intertwined with violence. Local lords maintained private armies or retainers to enforce laws and protect their interests. Feuds between noble families could erupt into bloody conflicts lasting generations. Banditry and highway robbery thrived in unsettled regions, or during times of war. Travelers and merchants risked attack, losing goods or lives. Some bandits operated with tacit approval or protection from local authorities, blurring lines between crime and politics. Survival demanded constant vigilance and preparedness for violence. Communities formed militias or watch groups to defend against raids. Fortifications, even simple wooden palisades, were crucial for protection. The psychological toll of living in a violent world was immense. Fear and trauma shaped behavior, social relations, and cultural expression. Religious belief often provided solace, framing suffering as part of a divine plan or test. The warrior code of chivalry emerged during this period, promoting ideals of honor, loyalty, and protection of the weak. Yet, in reality, warfare was often chaotic and merciless, with civilians frequently caught in the crossfire. Understanding the realities of medieval violence is essential to appreciating how difficult survival truly was. Every decision, from where to live, how to arm oneself, to when to flee, carried life or death consequences. As we move forward, we will explore how social structures, law, and order functioned within this violent context, and how medieval people coped with and resisted the threats surrounding them. Medieval society was a complex web of hierarchies, obligations, and unwritten rules that governed every aspect of life. To truly understand what it took to survive in the Middle Ages, one must delve deeply into the social structures that both supported and restricted individuals. Far from a simplistic division between nobles and peasants, medieval social order was layered, dynamic, and often unforgiving. At the apex of society stood the monarch king or queen whose authority was both absolute and fragile. Monarchs depended on the loyalty of their nobles, who in turn governed the lands and people under their control. The system was feudal, meaning that land was granted in exchange for military or other service, creating a pyramid of obligations stretching from the highest lord to the humblest serf. Nobles wielded tremendous power, but also faced the constant risk of political intrigue, rebellion, and shifting alliances. Their survival depended not only on battlefield prowess, but also on maintaining favor with the crown, managing estates effectively, and navigating the treacherous waters of medieval politics. Beneath the nobles were knights and lesser lords, often vassals to more powerful barons. Knights were expected to serve as heavily armed cavalry, protect their lord's interests, and uphold chivalric values. However, their income and status were precarious, relying heavily on landholdings and the spoils of war. The vast majority of the population were peasants, serfs tied to the land and subject to the authority of their lords. Peasants worked the fields, paid rents and taxes, and provided labor for their lord's manor. While some serfs lived with relative stability, their lives were marked by hard work, limited freedom, and vulnerability to exploitation. Free peasants existed too, though in smaller numbers. They owned or rented land, paid taxes, and sometimes participated in local governance. Their position offered slightly more autonomy, but did not guarantee safety from famine, war, or disease. Guilds formed an important middle layer within towns and cities. These were associations of craftsmen and merchants who controlled trade, quality of goods, and economic privileges. Membership in a guild offered protection, training, and social identity. But entry was often restricted and competitive. The church was a dominant force in medieval life, wielding spiritual, economic, and political influence. Clergy ranged from humble parish priests to powerful bishops and abbots who controlled vast lands and resources. The church provided education, charity, and moral guidance, but also enforced social norms and sanctioned rulers. Peasant life was defined by a cycle of seasons, festivals, and religious observances. Survival depended on the rhythms of planting, harvesting, and preparing for winter. Yet, this routine was punctuated by crises, bad harvests, outbreaks of disease, or demands from lords that could destabilize families and communities. Legal systems varied regionally, but were generally harsh and punitive. Crime could result in severe corporal punishment, exile, or death. Justice was often administered by local lords or ecclesiastical courts, with limited recourse for the accused. Survival required not only physical strength, but also social savvy. Alliances within villages, mutual aid during hard times, and participation in communal activities were vital. Those isolated or marginalized faced much greater risks. Women's roles, though constrained by patriarchy, were essential. They managed households, worked fields, bore children, and sometimes acted as healers or traders. Widowhood or loss of male protectors could drastically alter a woman's survival prospects. Children were valued for their labor and continuity of family lines, but high infant mortality was a grim reality. Education was limited and often reserved for the elite or clergy. Understanding medieval social structure reveals why survival was about more than just food and shelter. It was about navigating a web of relationships, power, and expectations that shaped every decision. As we continue, the next section will delve into the crucial role of religion and superstition in medieval survival, how faith offered hope, order, and sometimes fear in a precarious world. The profound influence of religion on medieval survival cannot be overstated. Beyond shaping personal beliefs, the church controlled land, resources, and education. Monasteries were some of the most important centers for agricultural innovation and medical knowledge, preserving and advancing techniques that enabled communities to endure hard times. Monks cultivated medicinal herbs, copied ancient texts, and developed rudimentary hospitals places where the sick could find shelter and care, often combining spiritual healing with herbal remedies. Yet, even with the best efforts of religious institutions, medieval medicine was limited. Illnesses such as the plague, smallpox, tuberculosis, and leprosy spread rapidly through crowded towns and villages, often attributed to divine punishment or demonic influence. Without knowledge of bacteria or viruses, treatments were based on balancing the humors, prayer, or invoking saints' intercession. Bloodletting, purging, and herbal concoctions were common, though their effectiveness was questionable. Superstitions mixed with official church doctrine in ways that could be contradictory or even dangerous. For example, the fear of witches led to periodic witch hunts, especially during times of social stress or economic hardship. Those accused, often vulnerable women, faced brutal trials and executions. These episodes underscore the precariousness of medieval life and how superstition could amplify suffering. Faith also dictated social behaviors. Charity was both a religious duty and a social expectation. The wealthy were expected to support the poor and fund churches or hospitals, while the poor relied on alms and communal charity for survival. Religious festivals often included food distribution or communal meals, offering temporary relief from hunger. Pilgrimages were physically arduous and risky, but held spiritual importance. Traveling long distances exposed pilgrims to robbery, disease, and exhaustion. The journey itself was considered a form of penance and devotion, underscoring the intertwined nature of faith and survival. Education in medieval Europe was largely the preserve of the church. Monasteries, cathedral schools, and later universities taught Latin, theology, philosophy, and law knowledge that was inaccessible to most common folk. Literacy was rare outside the clergy and nobility, limiting access to information that could improve survival strategies. The church also shaped laws governing marriage, inheritance, and morality. These laws affected family structures and the transmission of property, influencing economic stability and social mobility. Women's lives were regulated by church doctrine, restricting rights, but also offering roles as nuns or patrons of religious institutions. Religious art and architecture symbolize the centrality of faith. Gothic cathedrals with soaring spires and stained glass windows inspired awe and reinforced religious teachings visually. These monumental structures took decades, or even centuries, to complete, reflecting collective effort and devotion. The fear of divine wrath was a powerful motivator. Events such as famines, plagues, or natural disasters were seen as signs of God's displeasure, prompting acts of penance, public prayers, or even violent scapegoating of minorities like Jews or heretics. In sum, medieval survival was inseparable from religion. Faith provided psychological comfort, social cohesion, and practical support, but also imposed strict norms and sometimes inflicted cruelty. To survive meant to live within this religious framework, balancing hope, fear, and obedience. If you've made it this far, you've already come to understand how relentlessly difficult medieval survival really was. But there's one final truth that ties all the other pieces together. The world was not only cruel, it was unrelentingly unpredictable. And unpredictability, in a time without insurance, social safety nets, or modern science, was perhaps the greatest killer of all. You might imagine a medieval peasant with a modest field, a few animals, and a family managing to live a quiet life. But that peaceful image would only last as long as everything around them did not go terribly wrong, which, in medieval Europe, it almost always did. Let's begin with something deceptively simple: the weather. Medieval Europe had no concept of climate science, no meteorology, and certainly no way to plan around or predict natural fluctuations in temperature, rainfall, or seasons. Entire harvests could be wiped out by an unexpected frost, excessive rain, or a summer that turned to drought. The Little Ice Age, which began around the 14th century, brought unpredictable and severe cold snaps across Europe. Crops failed en masse. Rivers froze. Famine spread. Survival for many meant facing the full force of nature with no way to fight back. When crops failed, starvation wasn't a slow threat. It was immediate and deadly. Most people had no grain stockpiles, no preserved food beyond salted meats or old bread. Communities became desperate. There are recorded instances of people boiling grass, eating bark, or digging up roots to survive. In some of the worst cases, there were whispers, even confessions of cannibalism. And when starvation didn't take lives, disease often did. Medieval towns were unhygienic and overcrowded. Waste was dumped into the streets or nearby rivers. Rats and lice were everywhere. It was a perfect breeding ground for disease. The most infamous of these, of course, was the Black Death, the bubonic plague, which swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, killing up to 60% of the population in some areas. You might think you could survive such an outbreak by running to the countryside, but even rural areas weren't safe. The disease traveled fast, following trade routes, animal carriers, and even the wind, in the minds of those trying to make sense of it. With no understanding of bacteria, people turned to superstition, bloodletting, purging, and prayer. None of it worked. Entire villages were wiped out. Families died in their homes, with no one left to bury them. And even if you managed to survive famine and plague, you still had to contend with violence, not just from wars, but from the people around you. Banditry was rampant. In times of crisis, as law enforcement collapsed or retreated to protect the elites, poor and desperate people turned on each other. Traveling alone could be a death sentence. Merchants hired armed guards. Pilgrims banded together for protection. Even peaceful villages kept sentries or lookouts for roaming raiders and thieves. And sometimes, the threat came not from strangers, but from your own lord. In feudal Europe, you were at the mercy of whoever owned the land you lived on. A cruel lord could increase your taxes, demand more grain, or even take your children for service in his household or army. You couldn't protest. You couldn't move without permission. Your survival depended entirely on your ability to stay in your lord's good favor. Now consider the mental toll. Imagine waking up each day not knowing if your food would last, if your family would fall sick, or if soldiers would arrive to burn your village for someone else's war. There were no counselors, no medicine for trauma, no room to collapse or take a break. People developed a kind of hardened emotional endurance. They had to, or they wouldn't make it. And yet, even amid the darkness, people found ways to keep going. They sang songs during harvests. They gathered for religious festivals. They told stories by the fire to pass the long winters. Children played with wooden toys. Lovers carved hearts into tree bark. There was beauty, but it existed in contrast to the ever-present danger, and it often didn't last. To survive the medieval world, you needed food, shelter, and protection. But even more than that, you needed community, faith, adaptability, and luck, an enormous amount of luck. Because the truth is, survival often came down to circumstances entirely out of your control. You won't make it in the medieval world, not because you're weak, but because the world itself was unyielding. It wasn't built for you. It was built for hardship, and only the hard survived. It becomes painfully clear that endurance alone wasn't enough. No single virtue guaranteed your safety. No solitary skill could ensure your survival. Instead, you had to possess a delicate combination of traits: resilience, obedience, resourcefulness, and above all, adaptability to the constant motion of a brutal and indifferent world. In this part, we peer into one of the most misunderstood and overlooked aspects of medieval survival: the social labyrinth. To survive wasn't just about tilling the soil, sharpening your blade, or knowing which herbs to chew when fever struck. It was also about navigating a deeply hierarchical and unforgiving society, where your social position wasn't just a label, it was your fate. At the very bottom of this order were the serfs. Bound to the land, they lived under the thumb of lords, who could dictate everything from their taxes to their marriages. Serfs could not legally leave their manors without permission. They were taxed for grinding their grain, taxed for using the lord's ovens, taxed even at times of death. A funeral could be an expense that pushed a family into total ruin. Yet, even under this weight, many serfs clung to the familiarity of their role because the unknown beyond the manor's reach was even more terrifying. For those few who climbed even slightly above the freemen, tradespeople, or yeoman farmer's life was marginally better, but still unstable. A single failed harvest could drive a once independent man into debt and servitude. Blacksmiths and coopers might find steady work in towns, but they paid for that opportunity with higher taxes, guild fees, and vulnerability to urban disease outbreaks that swept through the dense, unclean city streets with devastating efficiency. Even among the clergy, whose robes should have offered security, many lived meager lives. Only the higher clergy, bishops, abbots, cardinals tasted comfort. Parish priests might receive tithes, but they often had to support themselves with manual labor or rely on the charity of those they served. Yet, these priests were expected to offer spiritual guidance, to comfort the dying, to remain morally upright and steadfast even when the world around them collapsed. And above all of them stood the nobility and monarchs, who enjoyed the fruits of others' labor, but were not immune to the chaos. Power was a dangerous burden. Nobles were constantly at risk of betrayal, rebellion, and war. Kings were always fighting to maintain their legitimacy, sometimes from their own brothers or sons. A lord might dine on roasted venison one night and ride to battle the next, uncertain if he'd return to his manor or rot on a battlefield. Yet despite the violence, the suffering, and the rigid barriers between social classes, society functioned with clockwork precision. Every person had a role, and deviation meant danger. To survive, you had to know your place, fulfill your duties, and suppress any ambition that couldn't be realized within the narrow constraints of your station. You might dream of escaping to a monastery or running away to a city where guilds offered protection and trade. But even these avenues were limited. Monasteries had quotas. Guilds had rules, tests, and entry fees. And the moment you failed to prove your worth, you risked losing everything. There was no safety net, no fallback, no mercy. The rules were as clear as they were cruel. Know your role, keep your head down, do what you're told, and pray that fate is kind. So here we are. After trudging through the dirt-caked streets of the past, through famine, plague, feudal chains, and unrelenting hardship, it's time to close the story. Not with triumph, not with glory, but with the cold clarity that this world, this medieval world, would have broken you. Not because you're not smart enough or strong enough, but because survival here wasn't just about strength. It was about conformity, endurance, luck, and often sheer submission. The average person in the Middle Ages didn't thrive. They endured. They didn't fight for progress. They fought to stay alive another day. And for every legend of knights and castles, there were tens of thousands of people living invisible lives, never recorded, never remembered, never escaping their assigned place. The most brutal truth of medieval survival was its invisibility. If you lived well enough to die old in your village, with your family buried nearby and your soul untroubled by sin, you were considered lucky beyond measure. This world, shaped by unbending hierarchies, ruthless environments, and an almost mythic sense of fatalism, demanded that people give more than they had and expect less than they needed. Women bore child after child, knowing most would not survive. Children learned to labor before they could fully read, if they were allowed to learn at all. Men died for lords who barely remembered their names. All the while, prayers floated into the cold stone of churches, hoping that someone or something was listening. And yet, people did survive. Somehow. They found ways to laugh, to celebrate, to worship. They built communities and rituals, passed down stories, and carved meaning into a world that gave them very little. If you dropped into that time today, stripped of your modern medicine, your knowledge, your conveniences, you would not last long. Not because you're not capable, but because you weren't forged by fire the way they were. You weren't hardened from birth. You weren't raised to fear the winter, to kneel before the church, to understand silence as a means of survival. So what did medieval survival really take? It took everything, and then it took more. Let us go deeper still, into the heart of what it meant to live in a time when destiny was rigid and fate was cruel, where your entire existence could be altered by the birth of a second child, a poor harvest, or the whim of a noble. You needed more than skill, more than obedience. You needed the right birth, the right luck, the right patron, and still you needed to endure. To make it through a single year unscathed required almost impossible alignment. Summer had to be mild, crops had to be plentiful, sickness had to pass you by, wars had to stay far away, lords had to remain generous, your body had to remain strong. The wolves in the forest had to stay hungry for someone else. The rivers couldn't flood your grain. Your wife had to survive childbirth. Your son had to avoid the pox. All of these were spinning wheels, each one able to tip your entire life into ruin. They didn't have safety nets, no hospitals as we know them, no emergency services, no antibiotics. If a child developed a fever in the night, you prayed. If the grain failed, you starved. If a nobleman took offense, you were punished. If a priest accused you of heresy, you were cast out or worse. Death came quickly, quietly, often without warning, and almost always without fairness. Even the idea of fairness is modern. In the medieval world, fairness was not expected. Justice, as we understand it, did not exist for most. Your rights were determined by your birth, your lord, and your usefulness. If you had nothing to offer, then no one owed you anything. The world was not cruel by exception, it was cruel by design. And yet, the people sang. They danced at feast days. They married, they mourned, they painted stories into chapel walls. They told folk tales by firelight. Humanity has a remarkable way of finding light in the deepest darkness. But let's not confuse joy with safety. They laughed, not because life was easy, but because it was hard, because tomorrow was not promised. Now imagine yourself there. No phone, no internet, no clean water at the turn of a faucet, no knowledge of what makes a disease or how to treat it. You don't know how to build a fire from wet wood. You don't know how to preserve food without refrigeration. You don't know which plants heal and which ones kill. Your muscles are not trained to work from dawn to dusk every day. Your gut is not prepared for spoiled meat or unboiled water. You would not last a week. But that's not a failure of character. It's the success of progress. We've moved so far beyond the need for these daily horrors that we can't imagine going back. We live longer, healthier, more informed lives because generations of people suffered, so we wouldn't have to. They lived in dirt so we could walk on pavement. They died at 30, so we could live to 80. They believed in spirits because science had not yet answered their prayers. So now, as this long journey through the past comes to a close, take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. Not with arrogance, but with awe. The world we live in now is not perfect, far from it. But it is a world built on the bones of those who endured what we could not. Medieval survival wasn't about mastering the land. It was about yielding to it. It was about knowing that the world owed you nothing, that God might test you, that your life would be short and painful and forgotten and living anyway. That is what it really took. If you thought the story ended with just surviving the Middle Ages, then you haven't understood the depth of its reach. Because medieval survival didn't just shape individuals, it shaped everything that came after. It forged the roots of nations, religions, social hierarchies, traditions, and even the very languages we speak today. So this, the final chapter, is not just about closing the book. It's about understanding the legacy left behind by those who lived and died under the weight of this brutal, beautiful, and bewildering age. The people who survived the Middle Ages were more than just survivors. They were builders. Builders of churches and of kingdoms. Of farming methods that would sustain generations. Of trade routes that connected distant cultures. Of families, lineages, and oral traditions. They knew nothing of the modern world, but everything we are today is owed in some way to the foundations they laid. And what did it take to build those foundations? Sacrifice. An almost unimaginable level of sacrifice. Let's walk, one last time, through the stone corridors of a medieval village. The sun is setting. The thatched roofs smoke with the evening fire. A woman is bringing in her last bundle of dried herbs from the fields. Her fingers are cracked from a season's work. Her back aches. She whispers a prayer, not for riches, but for another season. Just one more. Nearby, an old man sits at the doorway of his home, his eyes reflecting the glow of the fire inside. He has lost children to plague and land to debt. But he has lived. He watches the youngest children laugh in the muddy road. He says nothing, but his presence is a reminder that endurance is a form of defiance. These people didn't read history. They lived it. With every swing of the scythe, every harvest, every harsh winter survived. They carved a path forward. And now, you walk on it. You, with your heated homes, your endless access to knowledge, your freedom to question, to choose, to move. You are the product of their suffering and their perseverance. And let's not forget that not all stories were equal. The medieval world was cruelest to those born lowest. Serfs, women, orphans, the diseased, the exiled. But some found ways to bend the rules, to make cracks in the system. There were rebels and mystics, merchants who traveled the world, women who led households when their husbands were killed in war, children who grew into powerful abbots or abbesses. These were rare, but they mattered. They proved that even in a world stacked against them, some could rise, could fight back, could change. So why revisit all this darkness? Why drag the listener through disease and feudalism and starvation? Because to understand where we are, we must understand what it took to get here. Not just the victories, but the costs. The world is built on the backs of the forgotten. And if we don't remember them, their pain risks being repeated. Medieval survival wasn't clean. It wasn't cinematic. It was messy. It was personal. And it was constant. But it also carried with it a kind of strength that is easy to overlook. Not the strength of armor and swords, but of hands that dug, cooked, tended, sowed, healed, and buried. Of voices that prayed and sang and taught and warned. There is a legacy in that, a quiet power. So now, in this final moment, close your eyes. Imagine their world again. The damp chill of the stone chapel. The roar of wind through wooden shutters. The smell of fire and earth. The hum of a hymn carried by weary voices. And then, open your eyes and look around at your own life. You are not separate from them. You are the proof that they made it. And that despite the pain, the loss, the fear, the silence was their greatest achievement of all. They endured, so you could live. That is the true story of medieval survival. And that is why you wouldn't make it. But they did. And that, in the end, is everything.